All right, so if you've been with us the last few months, and even for you from First Baptist, you guys have been with us maybe 2 or 3 times, you know that we've been looking into what our Sunday worship service looks like. And we've been breaking down each portion one by one just to understand what it is that we're doing in that segment, why we do it, and how do we participate in it, right? So there's 2 aims that we set off with by deciding to teach this specific topical sermon, right? The first aim is the immediate aim. Our immediate aim is to gain a better understanding of what is going on a typical Sunday worship service. Sometimes we just come in on Sunday, week in and week out, and we absolutely have no idea what's going on. Sometimes for years we do that. Some of us have been coming to church all of our lives as far as we can remember. Some of you guys were born in this church, right? Specifically, we've been looking into what it is that Christians do, why they gather, why it is they do what they do when they gather, and how it is that we too can participate, whether we are believers or we are still questioning whether or not God is real or whether we actually hate God. There's ways to still participate in some way, shape, or form, right? And my hope is that as we begin to understand these things, it would actually increase in us a desire to worship God, not just to be bystanders and waiting for the service to end, right? So here's a little bit of an analogy. What's wrong with this picture here? Can somebody tell me what's wrong with this picture here? Bill. Ooh, who said that? Was that Brian? All right. I don't think the Denver Broncos are doing so good, so just kidding. That's right, though. Actually, that's the answer. Yes.
That's the answer.
That's the answer. What's wrong is Carolyn is not wearing anything with the Bills on it. That's wrong. So if you guys don't know, before Carolyn and I, well, this is actually our second day of being married together. We went upstate New York, and we saw many Bills fans while we were on this hike. We have one here tonight with us somewhere. He took off, okay. And she knew nothing about the Buffalo Bills. She didn't really know much about football, period. So whenever I would watch a game, she would just kind of, whatever. I don't really care about these things, so why does it matter for me, right? But over time, I began to explain the rules of football to her. Over time, I began to explain the rules of the NFL. And actually, what happened as she began to learn the rules and actually watch some of the games, she actually began to enjoy watching the game with me, okay? That's kind of what our immediate aim is. We're trying to figure out what it is that's going on in our church service, and by doing so, I hope that actually you guys would understand a little bit more of why it is that Christians do such a thing, or why it actually is beneficial for you too, instead of, again, being a bystander. The second aim is the ultimate aim. All right, that's the immediate aim. The ultimate aim, obviously, it's not just so you learn about church and the church service. The ultimate aim is for us to grow in an understanding of God's love for us. Each aspect of our service teaches us something about God, His love for us, what He's done for us, even of ourselves, right? That we fall short of His perfect standard, that none of us comes close to being good enough for God. And in learning those things through the aspects of our service, we want to grow in a genuine desire to worship Him. We don't want you guys to just come to church and just pretend to worship, right? We want there to be an actual genuine desire to love God, knowing that He loves you first. So after Carolyn learned all those things, this is what she kind of looks like now. She's gone to a couple of games. She has a jersey. Look at her smiling. She's so happy. She's learned the rule. And it's a silly example, right? And you might say, I'm borderline idolizing the Buffalo Bills. Let's not talk about that. But the point is, when she began to learn about the rules and the game, she watched it. As she watched it, she began to learn the players. She began to know their names. As she began to know their names, actually, she doesn't just like watching football now. She actually likes the Buffalo Bills. She probably doesn't love them. Yesterday, we kind of caught a little bit of the game, and she was on her phone. And He wasn't too interested. So the analogy falls flat somewhere, right? But no, she will actually go the length to go to Buffalo and watch a game with me. She actually likes the team, okay? Same with us. When we start learning why God teaches us certain things, we begin to know who God is, like we begin to know the Buffalo Bill players. We actually begin to grow in a love for him. And when we grow in a love for him, the immediate response is we'll desire to serve him and to live in a way that he's called us to live, because we know that it's a good God that's telling us those things. So that's the ultimate aim. So we've gone through our order from the call to worship to praise to prayer, fellowship. Today we jump into the lovely, lovely topic of the offering. The offering. First off, some people might call it tithes. Some people might call it offerings. Some people might call it giving, right? Raise your hand if you know what this portion is about. Raise your hand if you have heard of what an offering is or tithing is. Wow, not many of us. All right, honestly speaking, I'm not going to call on you guys, don't worry. Raise your hand if you know what an offering is. All right. Tell me, is there anyone that can tell me a little bit about what it is or what you think it might be? What is an offering? Or maybe, is there someone here that actually gives on a Sunday or has a plan to give? Anyone want to share? Whether from First Baptist or from New Hope? Anybody? What is an offering? You don't have to give the right answer, but what do you think it is? What is your idea of it now? What do you know about it now? Someone help me out here. It's not a trick question, I promise. All right, Joshua.
So it's probably not right, but so from what I know, right, is during service, like they announce things. So we at New Hope we don't give an offering box to pass around, but in the back we do have a box that if you want to donate, you can put and stuff. That's the extent of it, my knowledge.
And what's in that box?
I'm guessing it's something of monetary value.
Something of monetary value. Joshua is right. So there's a portion of our service where someone will come up and pray for the offering. Some churches will pass around. Raise your hand if you've been to a church where they pass around the offering basket. Yeah, I grew up to. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just a different way to do it, right? Raise your hand if there was a church where you'd have to go down the aisle and put the offering in the middle. Anyone ever? Brendan's seen that? There's different ways that churches collect money. And if you don't understand why they do that, it just looks like this is a scheme. The church is taking my money. It just looks like that, right? But I want to hopefully assure you that that is exactly not what's happening, okay? So there's a lot to cover here in this portion. It's a lot, too much probably to include into one 30-minute sermon. So if you have questions after, you can ask them in your small groups. You can come to us. You can go to the other parents of First Baptist. You can go to Joe, Brian. Go to your own parents and ask more about it, right? We're not going to cover everything. So we're going to focus the bulk of our time in the New Testament. But before we get into today's text, I actually wanted to take a brief look at the Old Testament, all right? And the reason why I want to give a brief overview of the text in the Old Testament is because there are no explicit commands in the New Testament that tell Christians that they need to give tithes and offerings. Did you guys hear me? There's no commands in the New Testament that says you need to give to the church. You heard it first here, right? There's no commands that say that we need to give our money to God. There's absolutely no command. So technically, it's not sinful to not give. But we'll talk about principles in a second here. So if there are no explicit commands that God gives in the New Testament to give, then why should Christians give offerings at all? Well, I hope I can clarify that for you today. And because even though there are no commands to give like we do right now in our church, I think there's still good biblical reasons to believe that God still desires us to be cheerful givers. So we'll first look at the Old Testament because I think it lays a skeleton for why some of the New Testament churches began to give their money and give their resources to people. And we'll also begin to see God's heart behind why he commanded people, his Israelites in the Old Testament, to actually give tithes and offerings. All right. So the Old Testament text is from Deuteronomy chapter 14, 22 to 29. I'm going to actually show it up here so you don't have to turn to that. But the New Testament text that you guys should turn to right now is 2 Corinthians chapter 8, 1 through 9. 2 Corinthians chapter 8, 1 through 9. So go ahead and turn there. I'm going to give you guys 10 seconds.
Wait, what?
By now, you guys should be masters at finding 2 Corinthians chapter 8. Actually, yeah, oh, right there, guys. 2 Corinthians chapter 8, 1 through 9. All right, I'll give you more than 10 seconds, but
Oh, no, I found it.
raise your hand if you got it. Raise your hand. Oh, yeah. Victoria, you have a question? All right, Victoria needs a Bible. Anybody? We have some extra Bibles. Teachers. Brendan needs a Bible. All right, we're bringing some. Thank you. Guys, take note of this. This is called giving. That's a giving thing. Good. All right. Almost there, everybody. If you're not there in the next 5 seconds, then you need to leave. 5, 4. I'm just kidding. You there? Everyone there? Lucas? Elise? Good. Elise? Noah? Are you there? What are you eating? Grapes? Okay. All right. You there? You good? Awesome. All right. 2 Corinthians chapter 8, 1 through 9. Just hold your place there, okay? So we're going to dive first into the Old Testament. And here's the text. It's quite long, so I'm not going to read it all. Well, I will read it. And then I will explain it very, very succinctly, okay? You shall tithe. So this is God's command to the Israelites, all right? And this is, again, giving us a picture of God's heart for us, but also a skeleton of what it looks like to give tithes and offerings. You shall tithe, which means to give, all the yield of your seed that comes from the field year by year, and before the Lord your God, in the place that he will choose to make his name dwell there. You shall eat the tithe of your grain, of your wine, and of your oil, and of the firstborn of your herd and flock, that you may learn to fear the Lord your God always. And if the way is too long for you, meaning if it's too far for you to bring all those offerings to that place, so that you are not able to carry the tithe, when the Lord your God blesses you, because the place is too far from you, which the Lord your God chooses to set his name there, then you shall turn it into money, bind up the money in your hand, and go to the place that the Lord your God chooses and spend the money there for whatever you desire. They had tables where they would sell things to people that were coming from far away. Oxen or sheep or wine or strong drink, and whatever your appetite craves. Next. And you shall eat there before the Lord your God and rejoice. That's a key word, rejoice. You and your household. And you shall not neglect the Levite who is within your towns, for he has no portion or no inheritance with you, meaning give some to the priest. At the end of every 3 years, you shall bring out all of the tithe of your produce in the same year and lay it up within your towns. And the Levite, because he has no portion or inheritance with you, and the sojourner, meaning the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow, who are within your towns, shall come and eat and be filled, that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands that you do. There are 4 things that I want to point out very, very quickly before we go into the New Testament here, okay? 4 things that are important for us to understand from this text why God calls his people to give tithes, all right? It's not because God needs the money, because we know the world and all that's in it is God's. He doesn't need your money. He's not calling them to give them the sacrifice and that's it, because I need to be richer. That's not it. The first one is giving or tithes was an act of worshiping God. It was an act of worshiping God. So if you go to the next slide, if you look to verses 22 and 23, God commanded the Israelites every year to take a journey to bring offerings to a place he specified. And actually, does he tell them to burn it there? Does he tell them to just throw it there so they rot? By the way, it wasn't money back then. It was grains and it was cattle and things like that. No, he says what? He says to enjoy those offerings together with your family. He says, go to a specific place, take a portion of what you've received throughout the year, and eat it together. In verse 26, God says that you shall eat there before the Lord your God, and again, this is a key word, rejoice. Rejoice, you and your household. So God calling them to offer their grain and do this was an act of worship. It was so that it was good for them. They rejoiced while they did this. It was a happy thing to do, all right? Everything in the world is God's, like I was just saying. He does not need anything. His command to give, come and give, is mainly a command for them to take time to acknowledge the goodness of God. Think about the journey that they had to make to get to this far place, right? Think about the animals or the grain that they had to count up. Don't you think in their minds, because the Lord told them to do this, they would be thinking, okay, this is for the Lord. He has provided these things. Thank him. I'm going to enjoy this because this is from him, right? It's an act of being thankful to God. It's an act of worship. So the important thing to think about is God was seeking not what they had. God wasn't just coming to say, okay, give me all the stuff that I've given you. I want 10% of it back. He's not saying that. God is actually seeking them. He wants them and not their stuff, right? It's really important. Second thing is that this act of tithing and giving was a reminder that they were dependent on God for everything. They were dependent on God for everything. The end of verse 23 teaches that they were to learn the fear of the Lord. It wasn't like that God wanted them to be scared of him. It was more of like they wanted them to know, like, all these things that you have is actually from the Lord, whether you believe that or not, because he's created all things. The third thing, these offerings were actually supposed to help provide for the needs of those doing God's work. So the Levites were a group of people that they were priests, essentially, and they were working in the temples, to keep it very short, and they had no grain of their own. They had no cattle of their own. So when people came to give offerings, portions were supposed to be given to them so that they could keep doing what they're doing, actually helping these other people that are coming to give these offerings, right? It was to help provide and pay for them. Lastly, it was to help provide for the needs of people, right? And the people that God mentions are the three most vulnerable people back in those times, and actually even in today's times. The sojourners were people that were either fleeing for their countries, you could think refugees, or people that were kicked out of their countries. The fatherless were, back then in that society, the male figure pretty much brought in everything, right? And without a father, if your father passed away, it was really hard for your family to get by. So God is having these people, these families that have no fathers in mind. And then the widow is the wife of someone that her husband passed away, right? Has maybe no kids even, but her husband's not there to provide for her at that time. So God is saying, think about these people and give to them. Provide for them. Your offering, your giving to God was supposed to be giving to people. All right? That's really, really important that we understand that. All right? Now, there's other passages that talk about offerings and tithes in the Old Testament, but again, this one demonstrates the heart of God behind this call for his people to give. And like I mentioned before, there's no explicit command in the New Testament that is given to Christians about giving tithes and offerings. Keep that in mind. All right? There's many verses in the New Testament that do talk about how, for example, elders and pastors, because their main job is to take care of the church, that they should be provided for. There's New Testament passages for that. There's also passages that talk about giving to the poor, giving to the widow. There's many passages in the New Testament talking about that. So from those passages alone, we should know God's heart is still for us to start giving, to help people, right? But for today, I want to focus more on an example given to us in the New Testament of what it looked like for the early church to offer their money and resources in an act of worship to God and for the sake of others. All right? I specifically want to focus on what a life changed by the love of Jesus, changed by the truth of the gospel, will look like, especially regarding giving money and resources. So as we observe this example, we will see that there's actually a similarity that resembles the Old Testament commands that God gives us, that his New Testament church follows. All right? So that's why I gave the Old Testament. So let's turn to 2 Corinthians chapter 8, 1 through 9. And let me go ahead and read that for us right now. If you guys have it, go ahead and pull it up again or thumb to it. So 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 1 through 9. All right? Here is God's word. We want you to know, brothers, about the grace of God that has been given among the churches of Macedonia. For in a severe test of affliction, Their abundance of joy and their extreme poverty have overflowed in a wealth of generosity on their part. For they gave according to their means, as I can testify, and beyond their means of their own accord, begging us earnestly for the favor of taking part in the relief of the saints. And this not as we expected, but they gave themselves first to the Lord, and then by the will of God to us. Accordingly, we urged Titus that as he had started, so he should complete among you this act of grace. But as you excel in everything, in faith, in speech, in knowledge, in all earnestness, in our love for you, see that you excel in this act also, in this act of grace also. I say this not as a command, but to prove by the earnestness of others that your love also is genuine. And here's a kicker, the last verse that's most important. For you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sake he became poor, so that you by his poverty might become rich. We could probably just end it right there. It's a great text about giving and generosity. So as Paul is writing this letter to the Corinthians, there are a whole bunch of Christians in Jerusalem. That's where Christianity kind of exploded. It's where it started, right? Which is all the way over here. So this is Corinth. And as Paul is writing to these people in Corinth, he's talking about these Christians in Jerusalem that are suffering. They're in great need, all right? They're facing poverty and persecution. They needed food, they needed supplies, they needed money, they needed encouragement, because not only was the Roman government occupied there and kind of putting them down and actually killing Christians for their faith, but the Jewish Sanhedrin and the Jewish religious leaders were also persecuting these Christians, right? So in response to this, do you know what Paul does? He decides to go around to all these different churches all spread out through this area in the Middle East and to collect money to provide help for this church in Jerusalem. So he goes to Corinthians, or he writes a letter to the Corinthians, because they had promised that they were going to give Paul money to bring to the Jerusalems. But in this letter, he's not talking about the Corinthians. He's talking about another group of Christians that live all the way over here, up there, in Macedonia, okay? All right. The church in Macedonia had heard about the needs in Jerusalem, and they actually offered to help. But the crazy thing about these churches in Macedonia was that they were no better off than the churches in Jerusalem. They were also in a place of poverty, and they were also in a place of persecution. So verses 1 through 4 in 2 Corinthians chapter 8, I just want to reread that, all right? We want you to know, brothers, about the grace of God that has been given among the churches of Macedonia. For in a severe test of affliction, their abundance of joy and their extreme poverty have overflowed in a wealth of generosity on their part. For they gave according to their means, as I can testify, and beyond their means of their own accord, begging us earnestly for the favor of taking part in the relief of the saints. So look, they were in a severe test of affliction, and they were in extreme poverty. So when we think about poverty these days, it's like you're broke. You got nothing. But what does it mean to be extremely in poverty? It means you're broke, you got nothing, and much more, whatever that might look like. Maybe close to dying. I don't know. But this church is not doing great in the world's eyes, right? Even so, do you know what this church does in Macedonia? These Christians saw the need of other Christians, and there was an overflow in wealth of generosity. So the next slide, so in the green, and they gave what they had, what they could, and it says that they even gave beyond their means. It means that they gave even more than they had. They gave more than they might have even been able to account for. Sometimes it's really easy to give to people when you have a lot of money. Sometimes I might ask for some chips. There's times where I come in here and there's little kids playing and they got their bags of chips, and I say, "Can I get a chip?" And they give me one chip because they have a whole bag. But if you ever ask a little baby when they have this much chips left, "Can I get some chips?" They won't give it to you because they don't have enough for themselves. That's like these guys in Macedonia. They actually had probably negative the amount, if that's even possible. Yet they were like, "Paul, take our money. We need to help these people. Take it. Take it." It's crazy if you really think about it. They even begged Paul to take what they had in order to help these Christians in Jerusalem, some of whom they probably never ever met before in their lives. Think about that for a second, all right? These Christians in extreme poverty begged Paul to take what they could offer in order to help these Christians. Paul didn't ask them for this money. Actually, it says that Paul was surprised. He was like, really? You guys don't have anything, and the things that you want to give are the things that you guys need, and you guys want to give yourselves to these people? It's pretty radical. The people, the church leaders in the Macedonian churches, they weren't telling their people, you guys have to give money to these churches. You have to, or you can't come to this church. It wasn't like that. Each individual Christian in the Macedonian church was in their own decision, I need to help these Christians. I want to give. It was of their own will. That's what it says in the text, right? It's crazy. What? People would really do that? They would, right? So we have to stop and ask, why? Why would somebody give when they don't have enough to give? Or why would someone give when they could just use that for themselves? Because clearly they were in extreme poverty. They needed it themselves, right? Why? Why would these Macedonian Christians be willing to do that? It makes no sense. Well, we get a little clue back in verse 2. It's this short word that says, their abundance of joy. Their abundance of joy. It's clear. So what was their abundance of joy? It says that they were joyful while they did this. It wasn't like the little kid that's like your mom forces them to give you a chip. So they're like, oh, fine, whatever, and they can throw it at you, right? Have you ever done that, Ella? That's your cousin? Yes. Trust me, we're all kind of like that, right? All right, fine. You throw your bag of chips. Has Paul done that to you? Yeah. Paul, we'll talk later, all right? So it wasn't like they had an abundance of money, right? They still were joyful when they were giving what little they had. So what were they so joyful in? Were they joyful in the stuff that they had? No, they were in extreme poverty. Were they joyful in the homes that they had? No, probably not. What about their situation or the livestock or whatever? It wasn't anything about the material possessions that they had. Their joy did not come from the things that could be taken away in an instant, even in their health. Their joy wasn't in any of that stuff. The only explanation that can be gathered from the text and through the word is, well, their abundance of joy must have come from God. I'm not saying that God was giving them joy, but their abundance of joy was in knowing that God was theirs, that God loved them, and that God actually would provide for them. So the second half of verse 5 gives us a little more detail. So if you look there with me in second half of verse 5, these Macedonian Christians first gave themselves to the Lord. This means that they were fully devoted to God. They were fully trusting in God. God was their treasure. God was their everything for them. God was their joy. So even if they were killed that day because they believed in Jesus, they were fine because they knew that even if they were killed in their body, they would be resurrected and be with God that day. That's even far greater than being 100 years here on earth, right? They knew where their joy was. Their joy was in the Lord. Let me ask you guys this question. Do you guys have that joy? Do you guys have that joy? Or does your joy fluctuate so much from the things that happen in your school, with your friends, with college apps, with whatever, that you're always trying to figure out, I need this joy here. And you realize, it can't fulfill this. I need something else. Oh, maybe this person will do it for me. Oh, maybe this girlfriend. Or maybe this boyfriend. Or maybe this. None of the things in the world that are temporary will satisfy this joy of your heart. These Macedonians had the joy that God provided, the treasure of Christ. And having this abundance of joy, they were able to give of themselves to God's work to supply the needs of others. Or, in other words, like I was saying before in the Old Testament, their offering by giving what little they had was an act of worship. It was an act of worship. The Macedonian Christians, in their act of worship to God, joyfully, they freely gave or offered or tithed what they could in order to meet the needs of others. This kind of offering echoes or parallels God's heart behind his commands in the Old Testament, doesn't it? And what might have given these Christians this kind of joy, this overwhelming joy, this abundant joy, to be able to give what they have, even to their loss, to the benefit of others? Well, if we look down at verse 9, that kind of gives us the clue, right? The joy that enabled the Macedonian Christians to give even when it hurt to give, but also to be able to give with joy, was the fact that God had done the same for them. It says in verse 9, "For you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sake he became poor, so that you by his poverty might become rich." What the Macedonian Christians understood was that all that they even possessed was given to them by God in the first place. But more than that, more than what they had, the temporary things, remember, hear me clearly here. What they understood was that God's very presence in their life, his very love for them, was also given to them, and that God paid the ultimate price to do so when they couldn't give him anything to gain that kind of love. The verse isn't talking about material blessings, right? It isn't saying that Jesus became poor so that we could be rich in this life. A lot of churches preach that, but that is not the right gospel. That's false. God never promises that if we follow him, he's going to make us rich and money galore and make our lives' problems disappear. Jesus died on the cross so that we could... Did he die so that we could live our best lives now? Not necessarily, right? And if that was the case, don't you think the Macedonian Christians wouldn't be in such extreme poverty? You can ask them. Hopefully when you get to heaven. The verse is talking about a blessing that's far beyond what money and all the riches of this world could buy. It's talking about our relationship with God. On our own, we are poor. We are dead in our sin. We cannot do enough good things to make right our broken relationship with God. We're totally broke. You guys ever been totally broke before? Raise your hand if you literally have $0 to your name right now. Yeah, some of us actually have zero. You're broke, right? We have no credit on our account. We have nothing that we have that's able to tell and testify to God that, look, God, I'm good enough. I'm a good enough person, right? You love me, right? None of us. We all fall short of that. We all fall short of that. None of us are worthy of the presence of having this loving and good God in our lives and his favorable presence. We have no ability to generate anything to get close to his good presence because of our sin. And you guys know how this story goes, right? Because of the evil in our hearts. We might be able to look to the people in the news and be like, oh yeah, those people are really evil, right? Or those Christians are really evil, or those people, those kind of people are really... All of us fall short. All of us. All of us want nothing to do with God. We're separated and we are in spiritual poverty. We're broke. We don't deserve his love. We actually deserve to be condemned. And it's totally fine if God was to do that. The broke life that we have. You guys ever hear about how like the thug life didn't choose me, I chose the thug life, right? The broke life didn't choose us. We literally chose the broke life. We literally chose to say, God, I know you're all this good and stuff, you know, but I'm going to do my things my way. I'm going to walk my way. And you catch me if you want, but I'm going to do my own thing because I don't need you. Whether you think that's actually in your life or not, that's kind of all of our conditions, right? But the Bible teaches us that God, being rich in his mercy, because of the great love with which he loved you and me, even when we were dead in our trespasses, even when we were broke, he made us alive together with Christ, and by grace, you and I have been saved. Or if we go back to verse 9, the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, though he was rich, yet for your sake he became poor, so that you by his poverty might become rich. Guys, Jesus humbled himself. God stepped down and became man. And that's what we celebrate on Christmas, right? He entered into our sin-filled world and he lived a perfect life. He perfectly obeyed God the Father. He had no sin, not even one. None of us in here can even make it through the night without sinning one time. I promise you that. And if you think you can, then you just fail. And with that kind of perfect record that Jesus has, don't you think, literally he had no sin. When somebody spat in his face before he got crucified, no sin. If someone spat in my face, oh my goodness, I might, yeah, oof, you don't want to see that. Jesus got spat in his face, he got crucified, yet he did not hold any of that against these people. In fact, he said, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they do. He had no sin, not even one. And again, with that perfect record, would you think that Jesus deserved the high praise? Yeah, I think he deserved to be lifted up and glorified, right? But instead, it was God's plan that he would be crucified and he would die and that he would be buried instead. When Jesus was mocked, beaten, tortured, crucified, and killed, he didn't do it because he deserved it. He did it for your sake and my sake. He became poor and he took our punishment for our sin so that you and I could be welcomed into God's presence with forgiveness clothed in his perfect record of righteousness. When you come to understand that the God of this universe, the God that's made all the things that you see and don't see, the one whose opinion of you is the only one that matters. Right now, you might think that your friends' opinions matter a lot. The opinion of God matters the most. This God, whose opinion matters the most, he doesn't hold your sin against you, but instead he accepts you and loves you on the basis of what his son Jesus did. And when you really understand that, there's really no greater joy that you can feel. It might be hard to really conceptually understand what does it feel like to be forgiven by a God that I can't see. But when you do grasp that truth of how far you are from him, but yet how close he came to save you, your joy will abound, much like the Macedonians did. And this was where the abundance of joy came for the Macedonian Christians. Even in the midst of their severe affliction and extreme poverty, they gave what they had. This was where the abundance of joy came from. Enough so that they were willing to beg Paul. Paul was probably like, dude, you guys are so broke, I can't take your money. But they're like, please, Paul, take it. Give it to them. You must give it to them. What do? It's out of their joy that they were giving this. It wasn't just like they felt like they needed to do this because people will look at them weird if they don't give money. You ever get the people that had the offering passed around, you ever feel really guilty for just letting the offering pass by? You're just like, I got no money. It wasn't like that. They freely gave. When the thing came by, like, yes, take it, give them, even though they had nothing to give, right? And as a result, they could offer what much or what little they had in an act of worship. And by doing that, it actually met the needs of these people in Jerusalem. So I wanted to end today by answering the three questions that we typically have been talking about. What is an offering? Why do we do it? And how do we participate in it? I'll try to run through this quickly because I've gone 5 minutes over. So what is it? It's an act of worship. Remember what I said? Worship is not just like, oh, God, I love you. That's not what real worship is. Worship is worthship, right? Worthship. When you worship something, you worship it because it's worth it. Some of us buy some expensive shoes because it's worth that money. Some of us drop like $180 on shoes. Some of us drop $200. Some of us, there's some ridiculous amounts of money you can spend on shoes. I don't blame anyone for doing that because for that person, it's worth it. $500 for a pair of Jordans? Take it. It's worth it. That's kind of what worship looks like, right? So when we offer what little money that God gives us anyway, it's because we think God is worth it and we think helping people with this money is worth it. It's an act of worship, okay? Second is it's a response to God's grace by committing our possessions to him, right? So these people in Acts also gave of their clothes, their land. It wasn't just monetary stuff that they were giving. The box in the back of the church, yes, most likely has something of monetary value, but that's not all that people are giving in their offering. They're giving up of themselves to the Lord because they believe him. They believe that he is worth it. So why do we do it? Why do we do it? Well, again, I want to stress this act. It's an act of worship. We worship who is worth it, all right? That's why, because it's an act of worship. Second, it testifies to others of the life that is changed by God. If you guys start giving one day, when you guys start making your own money and start giving, some of you guys already know, start doing that, and your friends ask, where do you spend your money? And you tell them that you gave like a percentage of it to the church, they're going to be like, what? Why would you do that? Why would you ever do that? Well, it's because we believe that money isn't everything. but also we believe that God is worth it. That's why we do the things that we do with our money. Giving to God isn't because he needs anything from us. All that we offer to God is an act of worship. And this act of worship actually helps the need of others, right? So a couple of things that I want to point out from our church. Our church also collects tithes and offerings, right? Yeah, you could turn to that. And you might not know where all of our money goes to, but if you join our members meeting one day, you will know that the amount of money that our parents and we are offering to the Lord is collected, and actually it's not just used to, blow it off on whatever. It's actually used to help the needs of others. So we got missionaries in Cyprus that we help fund so that they can go and teach people that don't know about Jesus, so that they can help refugees that are fleeing their countries with the money that we're giving them. We have missionaries recently that went to Indonesia in a part where we don't even know about because it's very hostile there. And they're going there, selling all they had, receiving money from different churches to preach the gospel to people that have never heard about the name of Jesus before. We have missionaries in Taiwan who are there doing the same thing, reaching people with the gospel. We have an organization in the Bronx called Expect Hope that are helping expectant mothers that instead of choosing to give an abortion or get an abortion, they decided they need help to take care of this baby. So this organization actually takes them in, feeds them, trains them in a job so that they can not only have their baby, but also when they get out, they can have a job to support that baby. There's also students in Namibia that some of us have actually met when we went to Namibia on a mission trip, right? That we are helping pay for some of their seminary needs because the gospel is needed in Namibia. And we think that Jesus is worth it, and giving to these friends of ours is worth it. There's a church in the Bronx that's a sister church of ours, and we're providing things for them. We're helping them in little ways because we believe that the gospel needs to advance also in the Bronx. This is just a handful of things that our church is providing for, and that's all possible because people in our church, your parents, individuals, believe the gospel. They really believe that God is worth giving what little we have or what much we have for the sake of his glory. He is worth it. In addition to these organizations, obviously, like the Levites, the offerings, they're also providing for staff members, right? They're helping pay for the electricity in our church. They're helping pay for the equipment, things like that, things that our services need, the offering basket that we have, everything, helping pay to rent, everything, right? Snacks, all these snacks. Actually, yes, the snacks that we have a fund in our youth group, and that comes from people's giving, right? So how do we participate? Lastly, how do we participate? Thank you so much for being with me, guys. I know it's been a longer one. I appreciate it. Well, if you're already giving, some of you guys might already have a habit of giving to the church. It might just be a few dollars. I know Joe's kids, Jaden and Judah, they put $1 bill inside a little envelope every Sunday. They write their names, really small names, and they put it in. And Mr. Hosa, when he collects the funds, has to deal with this $1 bill somehow. It's great, though, because their heart is in it, right? Joe is trying to teach them that it's worth to give to God. They may not understand it yet, but they're giving, right? Some of you guys are already giving as well. If you're already in the habit of giving offering or tithes, recall that it's an act of worship. I know for Carolyn and me, it's a direct deposit. Every 2 times a week, it just gets taken from our account and goes. We've set that up, right? But the problem with that sometimes is we don't think about it. We don't remember that we're actually giving to the Lord. So one thing that we can do, Carolyn, is when we pray as a church together, we can remember, we're doing this as an act of worship because we believe that we don't need the money. We can give it to the Lord, and the Lord can use it to help people. All right? Now, maybe you find it hard to give, but you give anyway, right? And you think, dang, I need this money because if I have this money, I can buy this or I can buy that. Well, one thing that you can do and participate is pray during the time of offering and ask God to humble your heart to see that you don't need to hold on to that money so tightly. Pray to God to remind you of who Jesus was, that though he was rich, he became poor for your sake, not so that you can earn all the money in the world and keep it to yourself. No, so that you can give it of yourself to others. Another practical thing is when you get an allowance, some of you guys raise your hand if you get an allowance. Don't worry, I'm not going to make you guys give up your money if you don't want to. That's not the point of this. I'm not trying to collect your guys' money, right? Well, if you do give up an allowance or you receive a paycheck, make a practical habit, if you want to learn how to give, to first consider giving to God. There's this chicken bone analogy that people use. Sometimes it's like for Christians that make money, they treat the offering or giving to God like a chicken wing, right? They get their check, whatever it is in the beginning of the month, and they're like, ooh, I gotta buy this. They take a bite, buy this. And then at the end, they get the bone left. They're like, oh, okay, I guess I'll just give this to God, right? Don't do that. Don't give God the chicken bone, okay? If you really are serious about considering giving to the Lord, consider giving him your first fruits, right? It's an act of worship. If you're not giving, here's a couple practical tips. When the church gathers every Sunday and we pray for our tithes and offerings, listen to what the person up there is praying for. Listen to how Christians desire to give as an act of worship. And lastly, if you're convicted that there is good in giving, I want to encourage you guys to talk to your parents. Talk to us. Talk to Pastor Rob. See how you can learn to make it a practice to worship God in this specific way. All right? All right. I've gone way beyond, and actually I don't even know. What time is it? All right. We still have 15 minutes. Awesome. Okay. See, can you put up the small groups? We're going to meet in our small groups here.